Hello, welcome Creation Fellowship Santee. We have a different forum tonight that we're trying out. We have Douglas Van Dorn here. I found Douglas watching Prophecy Watchers, and he is quite the accomplished author. And I'm going to turn it right over to him for our new open forum tonight. And everybody, just to let you know, you are being recorded and you are being live streamed. So if you don't want to be in the recording, you can leave your cameras off and your microphones muted. If you do not mind being recorded or heard, you can unmute if you have a question to ask Doug Van Dorn. Okay, Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you tell us who you are, what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Nice to be with you all tonight. Yeah, I just found out about you. I don't know how long ago it's been, a month or 3 weeks or something like that, not too long. And I was asked to talk about giants tonight. So I'm a pastor, been a pastor for 22 years in Colorado, Reformed Baptist pastor. Church is called the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado. We started it back in 2002, right when my oldest kid was, she was actually born about 8 days before the crazy 9/11 stuff. So that's kind of how I remember when we started the church, and I've been doing that ever since. And how did I get into this strange topic of giants? So it's been a while. I think it's been about 15 years. I think I was preaching through. So I preach through books of the Bible, and I was preaching through Exodus, and I don't remember exactly where I was at, but I do a lot of research using journal articles for whatever reason. And in the Google search came up this journal article on a very important passage to the subject of giants, although most people might not really think it. It's Deuteronomy 32:8. And this is Moses's second song. And this was the content of that article. This verse, Deuteronomy 32:7 and 8 says, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God." So I just read that from the ESV, and his article was on the last couple of words there, the sons of God. If you were to read, for example, the New American Standard Bible, which only uses the Masoretic Hebrew text for its translation, it reads according to the number of the sons of Israel instead of the number of the sons of God.
Oh,
So this was like,
interesting. Well,
this was like a 40-page article just on this one little textual variant.
could you give that as Deuteronomy 32:7-8? I'm putting it in the
Yep,
chat if anybody wants to look it
yep.
up.
Deuteronomy 32:7 and 8.
Thank you.
So this became, I was really interested in the article, and basically I can tell you about this, I suppose, a little bit later if you want to know, but he was arguing that the original reading of that is the sons of God, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint that we also have of this, which are 1,000 years older than our oldest copy of the Masoretic Hebrew text. And I was like completely fascinated. I don't even know why I read the article other than it was just mesmerizing. And then I just kind of put it away because it actually didn't have much to do with what I was preaching on. And so a few weeks later, I'm a little bit later in Exodus, and I doing some more research, and I found another article, and I start reading it, and I thought, man, this really sounds like that article that I had read before, and I wonder if it's the same guy. So I went and looked at the author, and it turns out it was the same person. Now, back 15 years ago,
Do you recall who it was?
oh yeah, absolutely. 15 years ago, he was not known to hardly anybody in evangelicalism. He had done a lot of coast to coast AM radio shows with Art Bell, and then he had gone down to Roswell, New Mexico, probably 4 or 5 years in a row to give biblical theology lectures.
It's LA, isn't it?
It's not LA. No, it's
Oh,
not.
okay.
But LA would know who he was because he was friends with him. It was Michael Heiser.
Oh, Dr. Michael Heiser. Yes, he has passed away, but I followed him extensively.
Exactly. So, like I said, nobody knew who he was that I knew anyway, 15 years ago. And so I'm reading this stuff, and he happened to be giving away a copy of his Unseen Realm book. That's what it became, to his fan base on his website. And so I decided to just start reading it, and I could not put the thing down. And I read it twice, and I was so nerdy about it that I ended up creating a subject index at the back of it so that I could um, find references more easily. So as
Was
I'm
that the
reading,
Unseen Realm that you
it
read?
was the Unseen Realm, but he called it the myth that is true, is what he was titling it back before Logos ended up publishing it for him.
Okay.
And so it's mostly the same book, but slightly different, but basically the same idea. And this was the guy who had written this paper on this textual variant, the sons of God. So in that book, he talks about a number of very, very important things in obviously the unseen realm, since that's what they ended up titling it. And among those are, who are these sons of God, which is very relevant to Genesis 6, which is the giant story. He talked a lot about the giants themselves, which I had never really heard anybody give any other interpretation for them other than that these Nephilim are the sons of Seth. So we'll get into that when we get to the text. He talked a lot about Christ in the Old Testament, which was really my probably my favorite part of the book, because that's what I do. When I preach, I'm telling people about Christ. That's all I want to tell them about, frankly. And to learn that Christ is in the Old Testament in ways that I had never even considered was, I mean, it was just revolutionized my life. I don't know how else to say it. And so as I'm sitting here thinking about this stuff, having nobody to talk to, I ended up writing a book myself that I never published because it was basically plagiarizing everything that he had written. And I was only doing that for really my sake, to try and work through the information that was there, because like I said, I didn't have anybody to talk to about it or interact with. And that's kind of how I learned the subject matter.
Had
And
you ever heard where the uh, Old Testament, what is it? The New Testament is Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the
sure,
New Testament is the Old Testament
sure.
revealed.
Yeah, and I had known about, I mean, I had known that there was this idea of giants. I had known about what is called the divine council, which is this heavenly council of the sons of God, frankly, which was what he was
Psalm
arguing for in that
82.
text. Exactly. Psalm 82. And I'd heard a little bit about it, but I never heard anybody go deep into it. And then the whole angel of the Lord thing, I think I had heard people say that it's Christ, and then other people said it wasn't. But he went on such a deep dive with that subject, with the especially the word of God. John 1:1, in the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God. At seminary, they teach you that John is writing this against Gnosticism in the late first century, Gnostic pagans. But he basically made the argument that no, he's getting it from the Old Testament, and there was a person in the Old Testament called the Word of God. I never heard anybody say that in my life, which that's just tragic when you start to think about the fact that this is what they're teaching people in seminaries.
Yeah, and I had not heard that till just right now.
Yeah, he when Abraham in Genesis 15:1, it says that the Lord took Abraham and he showed him, how does it put it? Let me get it the exact phrase. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Now, what's so strange about that is that words don't come to people in visions, they come in ears because they're words. But this word comes in a vision. And then he goes systematically through several other stories, such as the story with Samuel when he's a little boy, how the word comes to him and lifts him up, and he sees him. And in Jeremiah's call in Jeremiah 1, the same kind of idea that the word touched me. And what he's arguing is that um, words like the word or the name of God or the glory of God or the arm of the Lord, or, and there's a whole bunch of them. that they're all different ways of talking about this person in the Old Testament called the angel of the Lord, and that the angel of the Lord is really Christ pre-incarnate. So I was
What
utterly fascinated with that.
what did you think about Melchizedek in the
Yeah,
Bible?
I recently did a podcast with the Blurry Creatures guys on that they haven't released yet, but my opinion is that Melchizedek is the same person.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Yeah. And I think Hebrews lends itself to that. So anyway, this is a long way of saying how I got interested in the giants. So what I did was, when I was done with my little plagiarized book, I thought to myself, I think I could actually maybe write a book on the giants. I think there's a lot more here that Mike hasn't dealt with. And so I did that, and that was back. I finished that in 2013, and then published it. And then over the course of the next couple of years, I became friends with Mike through basically a catechism, a question and answer book that I wrote on the supernatural. And I decided on a whim to just send it over to him and see if he might. I wanted him to just give me a blurb for the thing, because that'd be pretty cool. But he actually wrote me back and said that he wanted to publish this as a companion volume to his Unseen Realm, and that's what they ended up doing.
Oh, cool.
So it's called The Unseen Realm, a Q&A companion, I think is what they called it. It has the same cover and everything as his book. So I got to become friends with Mike, and we ended up doing a podcast together that we called Paranormal, where we reviewed peer-reviewed literature on really bizarre things. we had a panelist of there was like 5 or 6 of us that were part of that, and then yeah, then he passed away, just a year and a half ago, I guess it's been. So very sad, and he was the guy that was kind of promoting a lot of this stuff, and now it's kind of up to those of us who have come after to, I guess, take the baton up and keep talking about it. So I focused that particular my first book on the giants, and I really wanted to tell a biblical theology of the Nephilim. So a biblical theology as opposed to like a systematic thing, where I really go from Genesis, uh, the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation, and talk about how the giants are there, why they matter, who they are, how it's part of the storyline of the scripture. And I knew that there were a few other books on the Nephilim that were out there already. There weren't a lot of them. I also knew that I did not want to write a book like they were writing, because I don't get into end time speculation, and that's kind of what most people do when
Oh,
they
you're
write
not
on the
a
Nephilim.
prophecy guy?
I'm not a big prophecy guy. No, I was in that world, and I was a freshman in 1988. I don't know if you remember this book that came out, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 88.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That
And we
yeah,
were
that was
all
ridiculous.
we were all completely just freaked out about it, and everybody was on the edge of their seat, and it didn't happen. And the guy writes another one in 89, said he missed it by one thing, and then that didn't happen. And then another guy came out with 1994, and that didn't happen. Another guy in 96, and that didn't happen. And I just kind of got tired of it. So
I
I,
think
I
Campo in 2008 or 2009, some
yeah, I
guy
mean,
named
2000 was obviously a big one. 2001 was a big one. 2012 was a big one. It's like I just decided I wanted to write a book on the Giants that would be different from what other guys are doing. So I decided I wanted to end that first volume at the first coming instead of going into the second coming, because my opinion is that the church, as much as fun as it is to talk about the second coming and to speculate about it, and don't get me wrong, I do that. I just think the true power that we have as Christians is in understanding what Jesus has already done for us, and with as it regards the giants, how he has actually defeated them and what that means for us today. So that was the way that I brought that book to a climax. And a lot of people would say, well, how could you talk about giants in the New Testament? They're not even in the New Testament. And that's actually totally incorrect. They actually are in the New Testament.
Okay,
It's just
now
that
you have piqued my
people don't know
interest
what
for
they're
sure.
looking at.
Yes.
So here's the way that I went about writing the book is I went to Genesis 3:15, and this is the first gospel message in the Bible. It's really God talking to the serpent after the fall, after they've eaten the fruit. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so this verse is telling us about a coming war between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And I never had any problem believing that there was a spiritual seed of the serpent because, Jesus calls the Pharisees sons of the devil. And I don't think he's talking about how the devil actually was their biological father of every one of them. He was talking in a spiritual manner, that they're following after their spiritual head. Cain, same sort of a thing, is called that in Hebrews. The father is the devil. And but it's really spiritual. But when I read Mike's book on this, I came to the conclusion that this is really setting up the story of the giants in Genesis 6. So when I kind of in my circles in the reform world, they're huge on this whole idea that Genesis 6 is talking about Sethites marrying Canaanites, essentially. And a lot of them won't even entertain the idea that it has anything to do with supernatural at all. That's just basically the tradition that the church has inherited all the way back from Augustine and Chrysostom in the 5th century. And then the reformers at the Protestant Reformation, they didn't even really think to look into it. In fact, they didn't have most of the books that we have today in the intertestamental literature that confirms that that's actually not the right view. And so it hasn't been until really fairly recent decades that this has been really challenged. And today, I think most scholars would say that no, it has nothing to do with Sethites marrying Canaanites. It has to do with something much more
I just
interesting and crazy.
recently heard, I think it might have been you being interviewed on Prophecy Watchers about um, how that Sethite view came to be, and it didn't come to be until maybe the third or fourth
Yeah,
century.
that's right. Yeah, there's a scholar named Jaap Dodens who's out in the Netherlands, and then I think he teaches somewhere in one of the Eastern European countries. And he did his dissertation on the history of the interpretation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And you can get that on academia. You can go and read it. He has like 110 pages of just nothing but quotations from early church fathers and the early Jews and what they believed. And what's so interesting about that is that he proves that from all the known literature of the time, so it doesn't mean there wasn't something that we don't have, but all the known literature of the time in with the Jews prior to the New Testament, going all the way into the early 2nd century, every single Jew believed that we know of that it was a supernatural thing that happened, that the sons of God are actually angelic beings. And then he shows in the church, so starting really with the New Testament, with Jude and Peter, and then going into uh, the apostolic fathers, the early church fathers. This was the only view that was known in the church for the first 250 years. And then it was really the only view that was taken in the church until about the 4th century, the middle of the 4th century. So that's 300 plus years that it was the only view. And when you add them all up, it's something like 50 different sources that not a single one of them has anything to do with a Sethite interpretation of this passage. It all has to do with fallen heavenly beings coming to the daughters of men and creating basically demigods, which are the Nephilim.
Um, when as you progress here, will you be able to explain anything about the say the Greek and Roman myths and how they line up with possibly with the giants?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe it would be helpful just for people. I don't know how familiar everybody is with this topic, but if we look at Genesis 6:1, we can just go through it really quickly. Just Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And I can help you see from the text that this is, in fact, what it's talking about. And I'll read from the ESV here. When man began to multiply in the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them. So this is really important because the word man there is the Hebrew word Adam or Adam, where we get the guy's name in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. So Adam, the man, the plurality of Adam, Adam's children began to multiply in the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. So to who? to the sons of Adam, to the children of Adam. That's totally different than saying that they were born to the children of Cain. Cain's not in the text. Adam is in the text. The next verse says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. So the daughters of man are the same as they were in the first verse. So it's the daughters of Adam, literally the daughters of Adam. And so somehow the sons of God are distinct from these Adamite daughters. They're not of the same race. There's something different. Now, when you go to, there's about 10 other places in the Old Testament where the phrase sons of God appears. It's actually, Heiser argues that it's technical language. So
B'nai
you,
Elohim.
yeah, B'nai Elohim. So you can find things like Israel is God's firstborn son and stuff like that. But that's not what the phrase is here. This is a technical language that was used in the ancient Near East to refer to heavenly beings of the divine council. They would include guys like Baal and Yam, his brother in the Baal cycle. And that's who it's referring to. And we know this, for example, because in Job 38:7, God is talking to Job, and he tells Job, where were you when I created, you guys like this because about creation, where were you when I created the foundations of the earth? And he's talking really about there in like Genesis day 1 and day 2 stuff. So we know that man wasn't made until day 6. And so he's asking, where were you when all the sons of God were shouting for joy? Well, how can the sons of God shout for joy on day 2 if they're humans when we weren't created until day 6? So
Ah,
that's probably the best text that I take people to help them see that, yes, indeed, sons of God refer to something else other than us. Has to. Early on in Job, you see the sons of God appear as well in chapter 1 and chapter 2 when they go with Satan into heaven, and it's really a divine council scene where then Satan, who's acting kind of like a prosecuting attorney, God comes to him and says, hey, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, yeah, I can't do anything to touch him. And that lays the foundation of the book. But it's the sons of God who are going with Satan into heaven. And I don't know how in the world you can have human beings doing that sort of a thing. So this is the same phrase and it's the same idea. And it makes perfect sense of the context that these sons of God, now the Greek Septuagint will translate that as angels to help us understand even more that these are heavenly beings. So they take as their wives any as they choose. In verse 3, the Lord said, my spirit will not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. That's not referring to how old man will live. It's referring to how long it will be before the disaster comes. 100. So basically,
I
you're
think
going to
that's
have
a
a,
hotly debated topic in this room.
is it?
Yes, I think it was the disaster until the disaster, and
Right.
I know a few people in the room believe that's how long man was going to live.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how you can say that, just because later on in the genealogies, starting with like Moses, he lives to be 120 years, and then from then on, you don't find anybody living longer than that. But the problem with that is that you have literally 1,000 years where people are living longer than that, including all of the descendants between Noah and Abraham, including Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, all living uh,
Yeah, beyond
a
that.
long time. So anyway, I think that refers to how how long it will be before the flood, but that's kind of that verse is really kind of a parenthesis to what we're talking about tonight. So verse 4 is where you get the giants. So the word is the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. These are the mighty men who are of old, the men of renown. So you have the Nephilim, mighty men of old, and men of renown. They're all the same thing. And the question is, what does Nephilim mean? Now, this is something that uh, a lot of pop teaching on Nephilim, they don't understand this. So most
Another
people will,
hotly debated topic,
yeah,
right?
they will say that Nephilim comes from a Hebrew verb meaning to fall. The word is nephal. And so that its etymology is that. And so then they'll say that Nephilim means the fallen ones. The problem with that is that there's only one other verse in the whole Bible that even mentions the Nephilim with this word, and it's the last verse in Numbers 13. That chapter is where the spies go into the land, and then they come back, and they give a bad report to Moses. And so the very end of that section, I guess I could start in like verse 32. So this is Numbers 13, 32 and 33. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. So that establishes that they're giants. And then it says, and we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And the grasshoppers also confirms that they were giants. When you go and read I think it's in Numbers, but certainly in Joshua, you find that the sons of Anak are there, and Joshua has to kill them. And you go read in Josephus, and he tells you how huge these guys were, and definitely
When
they're
you say
giants.
Anak, is that with an A? You're not talking about Enoch, the one that
No,
was
it's
raptured.
Anak, Anak.
Oh,
So
Anak, like the
Anak,
yes.
yeah,
What was the race of they were called Anakims, right? Or
yeah, the Anakim, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And then they come from another, ancestor. But the key thing in this verse is that the word Nephilim actually appears twice. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. Now, why does that matter? It's because in the Hebrew, it's actually spelled two different ways. It's not spelled the same way. And so you have to account for the spelling. And the problem is that the second spelling, the one that's different from Genesis 6, has the letter Yod, which is basically our English letter Y in it. And the only way to account for how that Yod is there is through an Aramaic word. So Aramaic is actually a cousin language of Hebrew. And so it's got a lot of overlap in the way that the letters actually are the same letters. Any of the words resemble each other. And this Aramaic word that it spells Nephilim actually means a giant. That's its definition. And it seems, and this is what Heiser and others argue, that the second Nephilim is spelled differently. They call this a gloss, so it wasn't original to the text. It was something that a later scribe inserted for the people of his day to bring a little bit of clarification to who they were. In other words, it seems like even as far back as whenever that happened, probably Second Temple sometime, maybe the days of Ezra or something, that they had forgotten what the word itself meant. And so he puts this little Yod in there, this little Aramaic word, in order to help the people understand that the word means a giant. That's what it means. It doesn't mean fallen, it means a giant. And this is also what you find in the Septuagint translation, where it actually translates Genesis 6:4 as a giant, the gigantus. And you asked about the Greek myths, and that's coming right into the Greek myths, because this is exactly what these guys were called in the Greek myths. They were called gigantus.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so they actually translate not only Nephilim, but the men of renown, the Gibborim. They translate that with gigantus too. So they translate both of those words with the same word that we translate as giant. So if you were to get an English copy of the Septuagint, there's plenty of them out there,
I
every
have
one of
one.
them will read the giants were on the earth in those days. They won't read Nephilim.
Yeah, I did read that in there about 20 years ago, and that was my first exposure to giants. Um,
Exactly right.
I wanted to ask about the men of renown. Now, what do you say about that? Because when I read that in there, what are they trying to convey there?
So I think that this is actually coming into the whole context of what all the ancient peoples talked about as demigods. Whether you're dealing with Babylon and Gilgamesh, or in chapter 10 of Genesis with Nimrod, where he becomes a Gibborim, he becomes a mighty man on the earth. And some of the guys in this space, and I don't even, LA himself might say that he thinks that somehow Nimrod transformed himself into a Nephilim. There's a lot of speculation about that. That's interesting to me.
Yeah,
But
I heard LA say that.
yeah, so who were these guys in the mythology? Well, this is where you need to know a little bit of your myth. So let's go to Greek mythology just for a minute. And this goes into something Peter says. He talks about how these guys were locked into Tartarus. Your English translation will most likely read they were locked in hell. This is, I think, 2 Peter 2:4. And the Greek word is Tartarus. It's not the normal word for hell, which is either Hades or Gehenna. It's Tartarus. It's the only time that word is used anywhere in the New Testament at all. So it's like, why would he use that word? Especially when you understand that your Greek mythology is that this is where Zeus locked up Kronos and the Titans during the big war that they had when Zeus usurped him and became the high god of their pantheon.
And they used the word Tartarus for that.
They do. The Greeks use that word Tartarus for that.
Interesting.
And so what you have there is essentially to kind of put an overlay on them. Zeus is the equivalent of the sons of God in our text. And go to the Wikipedia, you'll see that Zeus had, relations with like 100 different women and had all these different children that came from him. Guys like Hercules or Perseus or whatever. These are all half God, half women. That's exactly the story of Genesis 6. And those characters, Hercules, Perseus, all the children of Zeus, born of women, are considered demigods. They're half men, half gods. And that's basically what Genesis 6:4 is playing into when it talks about men of renown.
Okay, I thought it might have meant that, but I just, there's so much information out there,
Yeah.
and, is your information more correct than LA's, more than, Michael Heiser? Trying to think of who else does it. Um,
Yeah, I think on most of this stuff, that we're in agreement on this. The only thing we'd probably be in disagreement on would be the speculation stuff, and that's stuff I just don't even talk about. So
well, that was very helpful. Um, and so far the story's great. Let's keep going.
okay, so if you can get to the point where you recognize that there's giants that are actually half human, half divine, that will become very important for the New Testament, by the way, when I get to that. But now you can start to kind of go backwards in your Bible and come to a genesis of where these guys come from after the flood. So you see, it says they're there in those days and also afterward. In other words, the Nephilim were there before the flood and they're there after the flood. And that's
And
what Numbers confirms, that they're still here after the flood.
we had a speaker mention that very thing. And then when I heard your interview, I knew I had to ask you to come speak. Um, that it was the giants during the Genesis time were not really giants, that they were just tall people.
Right. And I don't even know how in the world people can get that. Like in this whole Sethite, sons of Seth marrying daughters of Cain thing, they still have to deal with the fact that these guys are giants. And I know a lot of Christians marrying non-Christians. I don't know any of them having giants because of that.
My kids are rather short, actually.
So at any rate, when I first started teaching this to our church, one of the guys, he was having none of it. He was just getting frustrated and angry. He's like, what does this have to do with anything in the Bible? Just kind of getting mad, thinking I'm making stuff up. And I said, well, it kind of struck me. I said, well, man, you believe in Goliath, don't you? He goes, yeah. And I said, well, you know he's a giant, right? He goes, I mean, yeah, I guess so. I said, well, have you ever looked into his genealogy? And he said, no. And for this particular guy, I got him on that because he loves genealogies. So he started looking into the genealogy with me, and you find out that Goliath, and there's about four other giants that are mentioned contemporary with him. So that makes 5 giants. And by the way, just a sideline note, when David takes up 5 smooth stones, it's
He's
not because
intent.
he thinks he's going to miss. It's because there's 4 others of them that are there that he might have to kill too.
I love that. That is so awesome. Perry Stone taught that.
So when you look and see that Goliath comes from Rapha, which is where we get the word Rephaim, now you can start to go backwards and you can start to see, all right, where does Rephaim appear? And it shows up. First place it shows up is actually in Genesis 14. This is where there's this battle between 4 kings and 5 kings, and some of those kings are the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, it talks about how there's all these ites that are there, and the Rephaim are part of those. And you start to look at those tribal names, and then you start looking at where they appear in other places, and it very quickly becomes apparent that these guys are related to the Nephilim, are related to the Rephaim, and they're all called giants in various places. So whether it's in the Numbers 13 that gives a list of them, or in Deuteronomy chapter 2 is another really good text for this, because Deuteronomy 2 is recounting the history of the nations around Israel, and it basically says, look, the Moabites that were over there to the south and the east, they had this group of giants that they had to fight, and they dispossessed them. And then the Edomites, they had a group of giants and they dispossessed them. Well, most of those names that are given in Deuteronomy 2 show up in Genesis 14.
I
And
just have
so,
a quick
yeah, go
question
ahead.
on that. With the Edomites, weren't the Edomites descendants of Esau?
Yes, yes. So what's happening is that we're in the days of Moses, so we're way, way after Abraham. And there were people that were living in the land of Canaan when Abraham came into it. And part of the early part of my book shows you that I think that some of those people that Abraham actually dealt with, and not just in this Genesis 14, but others, especially the Amorite people, the Amorite kings, they were in themselves giants. And so by the time you get to Moses, what happened was there was a promise, I think it's given at the end of Genesis 17, that God tells Abraham something like, your people will be in a land not their own for 400 years or whatever, because the sins of the Amorites and the people in the land have not yet come to their full fruition. By the time you get to Moses, that has been fulfilled, and you find that now the nations around Israel, like the Edomites, their cousins, the Moabites, the Ammonites, who are descended from Lot, they've all had to fight these giants, and they've all defeated them. And now the giants that are left are King Og up in the northern part of Canaan, and then, throughout the other places where Joshua will have to defeat them. And
Og of Bashan.
yeah, yeah, Og and Sion, his either brother or cousin or whatever. The sons of Anak that we talked about are mentioned quite a bit in Joshua. And so you find that there's all these wars that start taking place. Whether it starts there in Genesis 14, which is actually right after that war ends, that's actually when Abraham meets Melchizedek on the plain there and offers him, a tenth of everything. Or whether it's Moses fighting Amalek, when that's the story when he has to have his hands held out and then they get too tired. And so
I
Joshua and Caleb have to hold them up.
and so Amalek was a giant. Does it say
Yes.
that in the Bible,
Yeah,
or
it
did I
does,
miss it?
because it
Okay.
does. So there, people get confused about Amalek because there was a son of Esau named Amalek. And a lot of the scholars will say that that's who Moses was fighting, but it's not. Um,
How
because
do
when
we
you
know that
go,
it's not? Because that's who I thought it was.
yeah, because when you go back to Genesis 14, you find that the Amalekites are in these giant wars. But here's the problem. Esau hasn't been born yet. So how could it possibly be one of his descendants? So in
Makes
other
sense.
words, there's 2 different Amalekites that are there in Genesis. One was there long before Esau was ever there. In fact, they were there before Abraham ever got to the land. And then the other one is a descendant of Esau. And my guess is what happened was that Esau was doing some bad things mixing with the Amalekites themselves. And so he probably named one of his children after them, after those guys.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So Moses fighting them, spying out the land. We've seen that in Numbers 13 that they're fighting, that they don't want to fight except for Joshua and Caleb because they don't have enough faith to go in there because these guys are absolutely gigantic and they're devouring the inhabitants and all this kind of stuff.
And do you think they ate people?
I do, and I think that's what devouring. I think that's what devouring is referring to in that text.
I wondered about that because I heard of a recent Kandahar giant that was
Uh
eating
huh.
people in Iran, or was it?
Absolutely.
No, it's saying Afghanistan. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
in
I
Afghanistan.
got you off topic. Keep
Nope,
going.
no problem. Yeah, keep asking the questions. Are good. So they're going into the land, and part of what's happening is that you will find all these laws that when Moses goes in and Joshua goes in to the land, they're supposed to completely destroy, utterly blot out, utterly annihilate every man, woman, child, and even the animals. And that bothers a lot of people. And this was one of the things that Mike brought out in the unseen realm that I think is just great. And a lot of other people have caught on to this. God does not actually ever tell Israel to wipe out the Edomites or to wipe out the Ammonites or to wipe out the Moabites. Every group of people that he tells them to wipe out are associated with the giants, every one of them. And so you have to ask yourself the question why that is. I think you guys will appreciate this as a Genesis, apologetics group of people. You know how in Genesis 1 it keeps saying that God made everything after its kind, after its
Yes.
kind, after its kind. The only other time you find that phrase is really in the Genesis 6 and maybe early 7 story before the flood hits, that all the animals came after their kind, after their kind, after the kind onto the ark. Why would it care? I mean, aren't all animals after their kind? What, isn't that redundant? Well, the answer to that is, if you understand Genesis 6, no, they're not. The Nephilim were actually an abomination that weren't even part of God's creation. They were a
Oh,
mixed, if you put it in terms of like Levitical law thinking, where you're not allowed to have mixed seeds in your field or mixed cloth that you're
cloth,
wearing
right?
your garments out of, that kind of stuff. Those are considered unclean in terms of the law code. And that's exactly what a Nephilim would have been considered because they weren't human, they weren't angelic, they were something mixed. They weren't something God created. They were something that became an abomination that the fallen angels either made through DNA manipulation or through relations that they had with women or whatever it was that happened. And so this becomes the reason why God says you're to absolutely wipe them off the face of the earth. It's not because God's some sort of a genocidal maniac. He doesn't even want him to do that with the other humans, but with these guys and those who have corrupted themselves with them. That's what that law is focusing on.
I will admit that when I first started reading the Bible, I've thought about I've been following Michael Heiser for 10 plus years, and he was the one who finally made it. I thought too, why are we killing men, women, and children? But they're not God's seed, so to say, or they're not his. Um, and that about the Edomites, that makes sense. I mean, they were kind of a thorn in Israel's side. You would think that God would have said, just mow them down, but you're right, he
Exactly.
didn't.
He didn't.
I
I mean, later we find that God says, I will destroy Edom, but he never gives Israel permission to do that.
That's like when you have a brother and a sister, and the parent steps in and smacks the sister for you.
Exactly.
I have several questions in the chat that I'm going to save for the end, but one is going to play right into this.
Sure.
Jimbo is asking, maybe that's where the centaur legends came from.
Sure. Absolutely. 100%. We'll get to that when I get to the New Testament. I'll talk about that just a little bit to help you
Okay,
understand that.
perfect. Hmm.
I'll just kind of finish up just this broad overview of the Old Testament. I'm going to give you. I'll just give you. Well, we know about Goliath, so I kind of already talked about that.
And
That's
Lammy.
yeah, Lammy. There's the Egyptian who's 7.5 feet tall, that kind of stuff. I think that what that is, those are kind of the last remaining guys that hadn't been killed in earlier times that were kind of being used as mercenaries by the human Philistines. So it calls Goliath a Philistine. That doesn't mean all Philistines were giants. To me, what that is saying is that they enlisted him as a mercenary to kind of be their hero, their champion. If you've
Yeah, I
ever
would.
seen the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, you see this exact thing where you have the two heroes fighting the war, and the rest of the army just stays on the side and waits for whichever one to win, and then whoever wins, then the other army just has to submit to them.
And that makes that makes sense. If the Philistines were giants by nature, uh, they would have won every war all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's one interesting one. It talks about the Amalekites again. There's a story where King Saul um, it captures Agag the Amalekite. And this becomes the reason why when Samuel sees that he hasn't killed him and Saul gives him his lame excuse that he wanted to keep him alive and take him as a captive and then take all his booty and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And Samuel gets absolutely irate. And then it's one of the most gruesome pictures in the Old Testament where Samuel hacks Agag into pieces. Why would he do that? It's because he's an Amalekite who comes from these Amalekites in the giant wars. And so that story actually fits right in line with this giant war that was predicted in Genesis 3:15, that there's going to be this war between these two seeds, the seed of the woman and then the seed of the serpent.
I'm going to go back and reread that.
So I'll move into the New Testament here just briefly, and then you guys can ask whatever questions you want. Because I said that the giants are in the New Testament, and strictly speaking, there aren't actually any giants embodied in the New Testament. That's not where they're found. Where they're found is in coming to understand the origin of what everybody in the ancient world. So just like I said that they all believed that Genesis 6 was talking about heavenly beings and not earth, humans marrying each other. The same is true for the origin of the unclean spirits in the Gospels. And I think I have a whole appendix in the book that shows how people believed this. They believed that when a giant Nephilim died, that because it's not from heaven or from earth, that it became something that haunts the air in between. And this became the origin of the unclean spirits. So, in other words, when Jesus is casting out demons and unclean spirits, he's actually continuing the war that goes throughout the entire Old Testament narrative with the giants. It's just that now they're in the disembodied form instead of an embodied form where they're huge. And like I said, everybody believed this in the early church, and the Jews believed the same things. There's pseudepigraphal writings that talk about this very explicitly, like the Testament of Solomon. You can go and read that, and we'll
Okay,
talk
the
about that kind of thing.
pseudepigrapha, that's an extra, that's not canon.
Those are right. Those are basically intertestamental books. There's about 80 to 100 of them that nobody
People
ever considered canon, but they were like, they're like contemporary books like we have today. Billy Graham writing on something or Ellie Marzulli writing on something. It's
or
that kind of a thing. So
or
they
people
never
quoting
considered
Spurgeon.
them. They never considered them scripture, but they did read them. And what they do is they show us what the people of that day thought.
A lot of people, when you mention extra biblical texts or um, what do they call it? Apoc- apocrypha.
Apocrypha or
Thank you.
pseudepigrapha, yeah. Hmm.
Yes. Um, people they'll get upset. I'm sure you've had that
Oh,
experience.
yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm not
yeah.
going to read that. Oh no, that's
Right.
not canon. And I don't think they understand. And if you could just explain again the value of it, but that it's not doctrine.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have at least one appendix in this book on that subject. By the way, here's the first copy of the book. It's that's the 2013 copy, Giant Sons of the Gods.
Can you put that in front of the camera and back a little bit so we can get a good
Yeah.
look at
And
it?
here's the new copy. So
Because there's a
the old
glare.
boring brown copy,
Oh yeah, that's good.
and then
Okay.
the new blue copy,
Our
which
our
has a little
Di
bit more material in it. So
our Diane has purchased your book, and
good for
and
Diane.
yeah, this is, like I said, this is a hotly debated topic in this
Yeah,
group.
I understand it. That's why I wanted to put an appendix on it for this very reason. Um, so the best way that I like to help people see this is that when we think about what the Bible is, so as a Reformed Christian, I hold to something called sola scriptura, which is that the Scripture alone is my ultimate authority. But what is it my ultimate authority for? Well, it's my ultimate authority for all the things that it talks about that are true, but especially for faith and life and obedience to God. I don't need anything else, and anything else that contradicts that or speaks against that is teaching something false. But what that doesn't mean is that I believe that the Bible is the only book that tells truth. Okay, so I go to school and I learn a grammar book about how to read English. That's teaching me truth of how to read English. Or I read some sort of a Ken Ham book on creation science or something like that. It's not the Bible, but I would believe that it's teaching truth about creation, right? So in the same way, these are books that the Jews used during the intertestamental time. So basically, when they came back from Babylon in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, for the next 400, 500 years, they're writing all kinds of books, and we have a whole bunch of them available. And some of these books are actually quoted and used in the New Testament. The biggest example of that is the book of First Enoch, that Jude actually literally quotes from one of the verses in the first chapter of that book.
I think Jesus quotes Enoch too, doesn't he?
Well, he certainly alludes to it. Enoch is alluded to all over the place, and it's never alluded to negatively. It's only positive. It doesn't mean that, again, it doesn't mean that they thought it was scripture, but it does mean that they thought it told truth, and so they used it freely. It's like when Paul, when he's in Athens, he quotes one of the Greek poets. Did not even your own poets say? And then he talks about how there's an unknown God or whatever. Like, he's not saying that therefore I think the Greek poet should be the Bible. He's just saying that, yeah, the Greek poet had truth here, and I'm gonna use that because you guys know who he is because you're in Athens.
That makes a
So
lot of sense.
uh,
And I see a lot of people um, quoting Spurgeon or
mhm,
any number of
exactly.
preachers. What's his name? Graham, and they read their books and things like that. And they don't think twice about that.
Right, right, exactly. But for whatever reason, and I'm not quite sure why it is. It could be kind of a hangover because the Protestants didn't like the Apocrypha and didn't want it to be in the Bible, whereas it is in the Catholic Bible. What's funny about that is that Martin Luther actually said he wanted everybody to read the Apocrypha. He just didn't believe that it was scripture, but he thought it was valuable to read and give you good history and some good wisdom and stuff like that. But it's kind of like we've knee jerked against that whole idea for whatever reason.
Well, I'm very not Catholic. And whenever something Catholic comes up, I always doubtful, etc. But
Yeah, but
it's
I mean that's a good thing to it's a good thing to talk about this because um it's really important to remember that the Catholics aren't wrong about everything. They believe in the Trinity, for example. So if we were to kick against anything that they believe because they're Catholic, we couldn't be Trinitarians. Make
yeah.
sense?
No, no, I get it. It's just me.
Yeah, no, I get it, and I think we all have that, Robin, to one degree or another. It's part of human nature. So all I'm trying to say is that I don't think that
Oh,
as
Doug,
we
you
think. So
froze. You froze. You said I don't, and then you froze.
oh, that's weird.
It
I
was
said
good.
I just
Oh
don't go
dear.
to them thinking that they're scripture. Just treat them like you would any other book, and then
Doug, uh, you have frozen. Oh dear.
Am I still here with you?
Now you are. You're trying to tell us something I think Satan doesn't want us to hear.
This happens all the time. So I think what I'll do is I wanted to mention, because the question brought up satyrs, and this is a really wild thing. There's a couple of passages in Isaiah that talk about satyrs and centaurs and sirens, and John in Revelation 18 actually comments on this passage. And this is where it gets so interesting.
What is the scripture again? I couldn't
So it's
get it.
Revelation 18, verse 2.
Okay. I'm putting it into the chat.
Yeah. And so this is what it says. He called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast." And so when you understand that John here is actually going back to the story in Isaiah 13, where this is where he gets this from. You go and read that little passage, and you'll see there's unclean birds there, there's unclean beasts there, and guess what? There's demons that are there. And these demons are sometimes called satyrs. Some of them are called centaurs. Some of them are called sirens. One of them is called the Lilith. All kinds of weird stuff going on there. And so the point is that the ancient people, again, thought of those creatures as demonic. Now, what I said earlier about the demons is that the demons were the giants. They were the Nephilim, the half human, half men, unclean spirits. However, what I'm saying here is that we can extend that to half animal, half heavenly being, and that becomes the origin of all of these weird chimeric creatures.
Yeah, chimeric, that's a good term. And that leads me to another question that somebody asked. So you don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that these fallen beings took animals as well as females?
I do not think it's beyond the realm of possibility. No.
Okay, because I've wondered about that because satyrs and the lion men of Moab, I mean they definitely have
Yeah.
reference to
Mm-hmm.
these chimeras in the
Yeah.
Bible, but your average Joe person reading the Bible, they're not going to get it. I try to read through the Bible every year, and I, I just gloss over the stuff I don't understand.
I mean, that's the purpose of writing a book, right? So that you can focus your attention on the one thing and really kind of go on a deep dive on it. So
Jim was saying maybe they could take any form. Maybe they could take the form of an animal. Maybe they took because uh, in order for the fallen to have relations with the women, it seems people are thinking. I think when people think that the fallen are giants, but they're not. You've had angels appearing to Abraham. Jesus appeared to Abraham with two angels. They appear as men. Um,
yeah, so that gets a little bit tricky, because when you read what the ancient Jews thought in the pseudepigrapha, there's differences of opinion. So sometimes the sons of God are actually described as fairly tall, like 8 feet tall.
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So that could explain it. To me, that actually kind of makes sense of what happens when Abraham actually sees them. If you read the Genesis 18 opening lines, it's like Abraham's under the tree, and then all of a sudden he sees these three guys, and he immediately knows who they are. How could he possibly know who they are unless there's something distinct about them that he would have recognized?
That's true.
So,
But
I mean, that's kind of a bunny trail. And people have differences of opinion about that, but I think that it is interesting that
and
they were
I
sometimes described that way.
think I'm talking about the mechanics of the situation
Yeah.
without being graphic.
Yeah. So the mechanics of it, just to kind of touch on that question that was just raised, I don't know if they could have appeared as animals or not. I just don't have information for that. It's theoretically possible, but I do know that the sons of God, that is the angels, for example, the very angels that came to Abraham in Genesis 18, when they leave and they go to Sodom, they're actually called men. Now, this becomes something that's in Hebrew. There's two words for a man. We've already seen one of them is the word Adam. That only ever applies to the sons of Adam. It never applies to anyone else. But there's another Hebrew word, which is the word ish, ish, and that word sometimes refers to humans, and it sometimes refers to angels, but we always translate it as men. So it's kind of like a genus species sort of a thing that we share ish manness with angels, but we do not share Adam manness with angels.
Oh, okay. That does make a lot of sense.
And this is why an angel can be called a man throughout the scripture.
Because I've heard Perry Stone, I'm following him for 25 years, and he's um, does talks on giants every so often and the mechanics of it. And he did not say, as you were speaking, that he didn't talk about the two different words for men, and so that was very very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, did you have more, or should I start asking my questions?
I just want to finish up
Hmm.
with this. So
Well,
the
this is
point
so great, so
the
thank you.
the point of Jesus fighting the demons, I just want you all to understand that the way, at least the way I wrote the book and the way I see it, is that Genesis 3:15 predicts that there will be a war. What I've tried to do is unfold a little bit of that war between the seed of Satan and the seed of the woman. Okay, but that war comes to a climax in the New Testament because the problem is in the Old Testament, it's never carried out perfectly. It's never carried out totally. It's never carried out without sin. And so that's why the Lord Jesus has to come. And when he's fighting the demons, he's actually engaging in this war and he's showing them that he is, in fact, the Son of God. It's kind of funny because the longest time in the Gospels, the only ones that know who Jesus is, the Son of God, is the demons.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
so nobody else seems to get the point. And they're totally afraid of him. They think he's going to come to judge them before the appointed time. And he's showing in his ministry that he has the power over them because of who he is. And this is the way that I finished the first edition of the book, is that in dying on the cross and then rising from the dead, and in between that, when he descends into hell, he's actually doing more than that. He's actually conquering them and the sons of God, their fathers, in a legal sense, that they no longer have the right to have the power over his people, and over the Gentiles that he calls to himself. And probably most people in this room are actually living proof of that. And if people are tormented by demons or they're living in unbelief, that's something that uh, the gospel has the power to save somebody from that immediately, because that is the kind of power that Jesus has, and that's the culmination of the war that's predicted in Genesis 3:15, at least in terms of its legal aspect, what we call justification by faith and being saved. Um, in the newer version, I added a couple of chapters just to kind of talk a little bit about Nephilim in the future, and whether they're here now. And I think it's in a physical form. I mean, and I think it's quite possible that there are giants that are still here now, and I think it's possible that giants might play some kind of a role in the end game, as it were, in a physical form and not just in demonic form. But I absolutely believe that the demons play a role in the end in terms of spiritual form. I think like Revelation 9 and the locusts that come out of the pit of hell, that's all demonic imagery, and it's really
Yes.
quite terrifying. And um, that's why I think being rooted in the first coming and knowing the power that Jesus actually has right now, and not thinking that I have to wait for the future for this all to, yeah, for it to end, but not for us to have victory in Christ. I mean, That's the good news of the gospel that the whole New Testament is full of. And so that's kind of, I guess
I
that's
love
kind of the
that.
way I'll leave the lecture here.
Okay, well, let me quick ask. So, and this has always been kind of unclear to me and maybe to somebody else in the room. So, Jesus ascended into hell, and now I've heard a couple different versions of that,
Uh-huh.
and that he takes back the keys,
Uh-huh.
but they also say that that Satan is the prince of the power of the air, and Daniel's messenger was held up 21 days by a spirit that he had to call help. He had to call Michael to help him fight it off. So did, did where's it? Where does Jesus come in where he's taking that from him, where he's sovereign here, but he's still called the prince of the power of the air?
Can you rephrase the question a little bit?
I know, right? I'm not making any sense. How do we did he take the keys from him and Satan is no longer the prince of the power of the air, or is that still the case?
Yeah, okay. So I think I understand your question. So this is why I'm trying to make a distinction between something that's legal and something that's like his presence. So there's a difference there.
Okay,
Um uh
that helps.
yeah, so this is where actually having divine counsel theology in your mind can help a little bit. I don't know that I can do this quickly or not, but basically the idea is that at the Tower of Babel, God gave the nations over to the sons of God. That's what that first verse that we looked at tonight talks about. And the very next verse says that actually Yahweh is Israel's portion and Jacob's inheritance. So in other words, if the sons of God are being set over the nations to rule over them, Israel is unique. They weren't even at the Tower of Babel. They were created many centuries later when God called Abraham, and then Jacob came, wrestled with him, and he called him Israel. That's the birth of Israel. He becomes their God. Now, you have to keep it in context, because if it's sons of God inheriting the nations, then the one who inherits Israel has to be the Son of God. Not just God in generic, and not the Father, not the Holy Spirit. It's the Son of God. He's inheriting Israel to be his people. The promise in Psalm 2 is that if he asks the Father, he will receive all the nations as his inheritance. And then in Psalm 82, because God is judging the heavenly beings for how they have ruled wickedly, the promise is that, yes, in fact, you, O God, the Son of God, will inherit all the nations. So when Jesus comes in human flesh and he has his perfect ministry and he dies on the cross as our sacrifice for our sin and ransoms us, he descends into hell and he takes the keys in a legal sense, so that this is my view. Other people might have a different view, but so that when the gospel comes to someone now, as opposed to the Old Testament, the gospel can come to me in Colorado, and I don't have to go to Israel and become circumcised and live in that country, because that's the only country that is legally the Lord's. Jesus has disinherited these guys of their legal inheritance. And so they still control people, they still hold them under their sway. But when the gospel comes and the power of the gospel goes into a person's life, they are set free and they no longer have to worship these entities that because God put them over them. It's all kind of a weird thing. It gets maybe
Yeah.
the best picture for it that you can get is if you remember the story of Naaman, the Syrian leper.
Yep. And he
He
goes
uh
and
he comes to Elisha and he says, "Hey, can you heal me of my leprosy?" And Elisha says, "Yeah, but you have to come down to the Jordan River to do it." Well, he's from Syria and he likes the Euphrates River better. It's closer and it's cleaner. And he goes, "Why would I want to come all the way down to your dirty old river when I have this one right here?" And Elisha says, "If you don't come down here, you're not going to get clean." So he comes down, he, bathes in the water and he's cleaned of his leprosy. And then he goes home but he takes a whole bunch of dirt from Israel with him.
Yeah.
Well, why does he do that? It's because that turf belongs to Yahweh, as opposed to in Syria, it belonged to the prince of Syria, whoever he happened to be.
Oh,
And
that's
so, in taking the dirt and then setting up a shrine, he's basically kind of exporting Israel to his place. That's a picture in the Old Testament of essentially what Jesus has done for us. He has made Christians so that we become the turf. We are the temple of God. And wherever we are, anywhere in the world, we're his. We belong to him. And there's nothing that Satan can legally do to stop that. That doesn't mean Satan isn't still prowling around like a roaring lion. It doesn't mean he doesn't have some kind of authority over the people that are still in darkness, the sons of darkness, if you want to call them that. It just means that Jesus has done something in the legal realm covenantally. He has one authority, and there's nothing that they can do to stop either that authority from going and saving people, or, when he comes back, from them ultimately being destroyed.
Oh, that was very good. That really helped me understand. I appreciate that. I'm going to run back through the chat here and see if I can find the questions. Oh, Linda said that she doesn't know much about giants. I hope, Linda, you're a little more informed now. Let's see. Oh,
Yes,
Linda,
thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
and Linda says to
I've been
have.
fascinated.
So have I been fascinated for 15 years, Linda, so you're not alone.
Okay, and then I have iPhone Cheryl. She says archaeological. Can you address the archaeological evidence of giants?
I can do it a little. Mostly the archaeological evidence that we have comes from the recent period of time. So there, I guess there is old archaeology, and then there's also not just archaeology, but eyewitness testimony, and also history books from other cultures and stuff like that talk about them. If you look at like the walls that they made, Jericho was said to be a city of giants. You look at its gigantic walls. Um, it's not absolute proof that there were giants, but it lends itself to everything that they believed and that they tell us that was going on there. There are reports that you'll find occasionally, especially back in the 1800s when the English were going through Israel and doing all their surveying and stuff, that they found like a cemetery of giant bones, or things like that.
Yeah,
Around
there's.
the
I'm
around
sorry.
the same time in the Americas, you find, man, there's thousands and thousands of these references to giants that are found in, especially the mounds in the Ohio Valley, eastern New York and stuff like that. But they're actually found all over the whole North American continent, and
Even in
I,
California.
even in California, yeah, on the Catalina Island, and I mean, they were everywhere, and my thought about that is that some of them were surely hoaxes, but with 1,000 plus, they weren't all hoaxes, and all it takes is one for it to be true. And I think what happened was, and Dr. Judd Burton agrees with me on this, is that what happened was that there was migrations from the Middle East at various points in time, and probably the biggest migration took place when Joshua kicked them out of the land. They didn't all die, so some of them fled, and as they fled, they went north and west. They went into Turkey and Gaul, Turkey, and then they went up into Gaul, and Julius Caesar fights them. I have a whole appendix on this. And then they go up into England and Ireland, and everywhere they go, because they're cannibals and they torment people and they steal children and everything else, the people fight them. Eventually, the people win because there's not enough of the giants, and so there's nowhere else for them to go. So they come over to North America, and this is the reason why there's so many giant stories and bones that you find in newspaper reports for between about 1750 and about 1930.
Yes. And Cheryl, we're probably going to have L.A. Marzulli on, and he can has a lot of information. And Ken Johnson,
Yeah,
Alpha
absolutely.
Rat, Alpha Rat, if you want to put into the chat and then, how to reach Ken Johnson, he's does a lot on that too. There is a lot of archaeological evidence, so it is there. Okay. So
It definitely is. Yeah, LA has some good stuff on the Caracas skulls down in South America.
yeah, Aaron went with him for that. And and LA has he's got his cult following for Watchers, the Watcher series,
Right.
which is I actually own a few of those. Okay, I'm just going through the chat here about any questions. Okay, Alpharad has some information in there. And then Diane, our regular, has a question for you. So let me get that. All right. I know Ron Wyatt. You're familiar with Ron Wyatt?
I know who he is.
I
Yeah.
think everybody does, right?
Yeah.
And the pastor of the Holy Land site. Oh, that's he spoke for us a few times. Todd Fink is his name.
Okay.
Um, say that Mrs. Noah was probably a giant. Oh, Diane, I should have read this before. I think it's Ham's wife that was the giant.
Yeah, that's usually what people will say. So there's a funny story again in the pseudepigrapha. It's actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls, believe it or not. Where I'm not saying this is true. I'm just telling you it's a story. So, um, when Noah is born, he has the complexion and the skin and the color of all this that looks like a watcher, a son of God, one of these fallen angels. And so when he's born, his dad looks at him and he's like he goes to his wife and he goes, were you with somebody that I don't know about? And she goes, no, I promise I wasn't. So he then goes over to his great grandfather Methuselah and he says, what's going on here? And he says, don't worry about it. Noah's perfectly human. So I bring that story up because the Jews were wrestling with the same kind of an ideas that we're wrestling with here. Usually when the first question people want to know is how did the giant survive the flood? And one of the explanations people will give is that one of maybe not, I've never heard it Noah's wife, but I have heard it like Ham's wife maybe carried the genetic material. And so that's where it came from. I don't actually tend to think that that's true because I think that would have defeated the whole point of God saving Noah because he was pure in his generations. In other words, he was biologically a human.
Yeah,
Why would
I
you save somebody that wasn't? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
I
So
wrestled with that too
yeah,
because
I think that the best answer to the problem is that, if you put it in terms of Kronos and the Greek myths, once those guys were locked away, and then God said he'd never flood the earth again, another group of them up there said, hey, he said he'd never just do that again. So why don't we go down and do something else? In other words, there was another incursion of it. And I actually think that that was what was going on at the Tower of Babel.
oh, okay, that makes sense. Um, so Diane, uh, Doug doesn't feel that they were. I don't know if you want to jump in here,
Yeah,
Diane. You can
I'm
unmute.
here. I'm here. Yeah, I wondered about that because they did find giant bones at the site that they found that they believe is where the ark landed.
Oh, I
And
have not heard that.
yes, if you go to the Holy Land site, there's a whole video on Noah's Ark.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it is very, very good. And but yeah, they found giant bones and they found one whatever pictograph or whatever it is, where there was the 8 people were pictured, and one of them was a giant.
Huh, that's
And it
interesting.
looked from the
Oh,
placement like it
yeah,
would have been Mrs. Noah.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Holy Land site.
Yeah,
Pastor Todd Fink. He spoke to
yeah,
us
yeah,
for a few
that's his
times. So
name.
thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
and I had wondered about that because what you said about God did this to wipe it out. So why would a giant's genes get through?
Right, exactly. And kind of to bring up the point I made earlier about pseudepigrapha, how these are just simply stories that were there, and you have to evaluate each one on its own. The same thing would be true for any kind of artwork or whatever that you would find. I mean, somebody clearly, obviously, thought that that was what it was, but it doesn't mean that that's the original and that it's the truth.
Can I interject something?
um, uh, if it's quick, Jeff, because I want to close out the recording and the live stream, and then we can
Okay.
let our so-called hair down.
I just wanted to say that Ken Johnson did extensive research in the Dead Sea Scrolls. His take on it was that prior to Noah, there were writings by the Nephilim or
Yeah,
whoever
yeah,
else.
yeah.
There were extensive writings that he had with him on the ark. And apparently some of those writings were taken to Mount Hermon. And sometime after that, somebody else went to Mount Hermon, found those writings and started following them. There apparently were recipes on how to mix animal DNA to create
Oh,
hybrids that had
interesting.
phenomenal properties.
Yeah.
That's his theory. It makes a lot of sense to me. It ties in with the Greek mythology, etc.
Yeah. I don't have a problem with any of that.
Thank you, Jeff. Now I'm going to have you mute again, Jeff. Doug, if you could show us your books again, tell us how we can, Diane's already purchased one. Tell us how we can get one. Tell us everything we need to know.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it so it's not here we go. It's Giant Sons of the Gods. And my name's Doug Van Dorn. And all my books are on Amazon.com. I have a website which is douglasvandorn.com. And you can go there, and I have tons and tons of podcasts that I have linked if you just go to the podcast page. And I've talked about this subject extensively with lots and lots of people. So if you're interested in more or just want a kind of different overview or whatever, feel free to go there and listen to any of those. I have a bunch of other books too that you can see on the site as well.
And that's Douglas Van Dorn.
Yeah, Douglas Van Dorn, Vandorn.
Yeah.
I also I forgot to mention this when I was going through Mike's stuff. That I did say that the angel of the Lord really caught my attention too, and so I wrote a book with a pastor friend of mine on the angel of the Lord too. That is it's not a companion in terms of the material is not really overlapping, but it is a companion in terms of the fact that the angel of the Lord is the main character of the Old Testament. And if anybody's interested in doing it, going deeper on that, then I would recommend that book as well.
And that's called Angel of the Lord.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. And we are Creation Fellowship Santee. We meet on most Thursdays online here in Zoom. If you want to get on our mailing list, email me at creationfellowshipsantee.com or at gmail.com, sorry. And we'll get you on the list so you can come and join us. All right, with that, I am going to turn off the live stream and the recording. So just bear with me here. I'm running all the systems myself tonight.